Hello, students, and welcome back to History of the United States 350 American West. So, what I want you to do today is imagine you're back in middle school. You're in your American history class and you just finished your first unit on Native American tribes, and now comes the moment where you are learning about American history. The mystery of Roanoke, the 1607 establishment of Jamestown, the Pilgrims settling in New England. Man, the adventure, the first European settlers, these brave souls that traversed the Atlantic for freedom and adventure. Yet, we forget that while England was just settling in the East Coast, Spain had long been exploring, conquering, and settling the American West for almost 80 years. Let's talk about the few key figures in those early explorations of the American West that come from Spain. Our first one is Cabez de Vaca. And when Cabez de Vaca left Spain in 1527, he had every intention on being one of the many conquistadors that were staking their claim in the New World. Under the command and leadership of Planifo del Neves, the group established a colony in what is now Tampa Bay, Florida. However, the native peoples took exception to the Spanish kidnapping their leader, and they chased the Spaniards out of their village. In fact, the Spanish ships had left them there, and so the expedition was forced to move into the local swamps to hide from the angry natives. However, finding their position untenable, and many of them suffering from a number of the illnesses that come about from living in a swampland, the explorers built rafts and sought to find their way back to Cuba. That way they could be safe and be able to reestablish their supply base. However, instead of a safe Cuban harbor, a hurricane battered the makeshift rafts. They sunk many of them, killing most of the conquistadors, and then the remaining survivors were dumped on the Texas coast. At this time, Cabez de Vaca found himself marooned with a handful of men, and they were at the mercy of the native peoples of Texas. De Vaca initially was captured and eventually was enslaved by the native people. He did this for about 2 years, and then finally he coordinated with a group of other Spaniards, and they managed to escape and go out and about in 1534. For the next 2 years, De Vaca and an ever-growing body of native followers, they thought of him as a healer and mystic because of different things that happened around him when he'd show up to villages. People saw him as sort of a healing savior. Most of it's brought upon because the Spanish illnesses were actually striking most of them. However, they didn't know that at the time. But as he's going through these explorations, he starts to go up and through Texas, the Southwest, the Sierra Madre Mountains, and finally he even makes it to the Pacific coast. All during this time they were traveling, he and his men, they were exploring the lands. They looked at native plants and they started documenting them. And one other thing that they really did that was critical is that they started studying the people. While during these long trips, they learned a wide variety of the native languages that were out there, and he also paid attention and took notes on native cultures. He made sure that he learned all about the different nuances of these cultures. And so he becomes an expert once he gets back from this captivity. In fact, he is Harold is an effective native ambassador for peace. And another thing that's really critical about him is that he's seen as very Christ-like because he was always built upon service and being a peacemaker. He was often used by Spain to make peace between warring native parties, and then he was also able to go into these different areas to teach and preach and learn. Now, De Vaca is known to be the first European to explore the Mississippi and see and describe an actual buffalo. 2 years after his escape, De Vaca finally and his men were able to get to the Pacific coast, and they were found by a group of Spanish slavers. Now, initially, when they found him, they weren't sure that he was even Spanish, and in fact, they thought about enslaving him, and he was kind of puzzled when he first saw him, too, because he'd been wandering around virtually without clothing for the last year and a half. Even when they talk about De Vaca being back in with the actual Spanish people, and they clothe him again, he said he didn't feel comfortable in clothes for days, and insisted upon sleeping on the floor a lot. But what he does eventually do is he writes what's known as the Joint Report in 1536, which gives a really detailed explanation about his journey and the explorations that he had done. And this is used by many Spanish travelers in the future. Now, while he doesn't have a detailed map, he does lay out very distinctly and clearly landmarks where villages are located at, and often these are enough that people are able to go back and revisit these areas that DeBaca had been through. He's also known as the first ethnographer of the American West. Now, one thing about DeBaca is that he becomes a very big advocate for the humane treatment of Native peoples. And he notes in his book that the Native peoples see and hear more and have the sharpest senses, I believe, of any people in the world. They're well-disposed, intelligent people, able to follow any doctrine if it's well presented. And in the lifetime of His Majesty, it will be possible to subject these people to the true Lord, because in the 2,000 leagues that we traveled by land and sea, we found no sacrifices nor idolatry. It is often missed in this historical accounts that DeBaca played on the future of explorations. He was frequently consulted about Native peoples, travel routes, and potentially for riches for the lands he explored. Now, DeBaca never distinctly says that there's like a lost city of gold or anything like that, which we'll cover here in just a minute. But some of the stuff that we learn here in the future was not spread by DeBaca. Now, he spent about 8 years among Native peoples in both North and South America. He spent time as governor in multiple regions throughout the area. And again, when we talk about his role in pushing for ethical treatment of Native peoples, he constantly was subjected to harassment and removed from posts because they often felt that he was too weak, being able to handle the Native populations, and often pushed too much for a peaceful resolution. DeBaca does hold a very significant place because of the ability that he has of understanding Native cultures. That's why it's very important that we learn about DeBaca first off here. Now, next, we come to somebody that a lot more people have learned about, and that is Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. Now, Coronado, he was definitely going out into the wilds of Western America to search for riches. And while we know that DeBaca was, initially a conquistador, he was nothing near what Coronado was. He wanted to go about and he wanted to conquer the North because he had heard of lost cities of gold. And he wanted that wealth that everybody else had been obtaining in South America and Mexico. So that's what really drove his sense of exploration. Now, while DeBaca returned with a wealth of knowledge, Coronado was dreamt returning with a wealth of gold. That's what his goal was. So going forth with the dubious reports compiled by Friar Marcos from Nice about the 7 cities of gold. Now, this is a really interesting story, not one that we have time to cover in this presentation, but it is a fascinating story about how Friar Marcos goes up north, and from all accounts, what it sounds like is he didn't find anything, and then he weaves this giant tale of lies that he pulls together. And some people believe that he's also was kind of hoodwinked by the Native people in order just to kind of get him out of his hair. But there's multiple portions of it that are really fabricated and interesting. But again, something else we can cover in another presentation for sure. Now, Coronado, when he learns about these 7 cities of gold, he believes, all right, I've hit the jackpot. Let's go north. So he goes up with 300 men, and he has about 1,000. In some cases, it's noted about 1,500 Native people from Mexico, and they go into what is known as modern-day Arizona, New Mexico. Now, he searches and he finds, of course, nothing, because we know that those areas were hardly habitable. In fact, most people were just barely making a living down there. I mean, they did have some, cotton growths that they had going on there, but nothing of gold. So as he's looking through these, he keeps torturing and harassing Native people who keep pushing him further and further north and east, hoping to get rid of them. And finally, he's eventually pushed all the way into Kansas before he realizes that, these cities don't exist, and I'm just on a fool's errand at this point. In his anger during this time, too, there's numerous reports of atrocities committed by his people towards the Native people who he feels lied to him. Now, when we talk about this, though, we do say that, his journey was a bust because he didn't come back rich. But the thing that Coronado and his men did is they made detailed maps, and they established trading posts in towns, which is very critical. And another thing that they did is they started to establish churches in the regions, and that would start to spread Catholicism to the Native people. And now the establishment of the church is an interesting thing, too, because it comes in conflict with the Spanish administrative state. And often this was, again, over the issue of native rights. Remember, DeBaca was big on native rights. Now, the Spanish found it profitable to enslave native peoples, but then they would often face objections by the Jesuits, who had converted large numbers of native people, and they had told those Spanish slavers that they had no rights to enslave the Christians. Now, these disputes frequently would end violently between the two parties. And the Jesuits themselves were not the violent ones. In fact, dying as a martyr for your beliefs and causes was kind of openly sought for by some of the Jesuits themselves. So they're not, dying in vain according to them, but the Spaniards themselves often would be at the receiving end of a violent native uprising if they were to kill the Jesuits that were near them typically. Not always, but lots of times this would occur. The administrative state and the church were constantly after each other during this time frame. Now, eventually, when Coronado does come back, he was placed on trial for a lot of the atrocities that were spoken about that he and his men had committed. Now, against those native populations. However, he was acquitted of many of the crimes, but a lot of the men that he went with and a number of his upper leaders, they were not fortunate, and they were convicted, and many of them were put to death for the crimes that they had committed against these native people. Now, in the end, of course, Coronado, he dies poor and destitute. Like a lot of conquistadors, unfortunately, we find out their fate is just one of misery, but at the same time, because of some of their actions, seems somewhat justified too. Now, his explorations, though, again, they open up the Southwest to Spanish missionaries, explorers, and these people who come pouring in after these two other men have gone up and they've explored the area, they start to really shape the culture of the Southwest of the United States. And also, they really start to put an imprint of Catholicism on the Southwest also. And so we start to see a unique culture rise, which is different in the West comparative to what we see in the East. While in the East, we have very Protestant religion. In the West, we see the rise of Catholicism. We see the rise of missions, Jesuits. We see all these different elements that start to arise in the West. That makes the West unique culturally in American history. Makes it a fascinating study when the two finally collide with each other. Now, the last one we come to is Bartholomew Ferrero. Now, in 1542, Captain Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo and Bartholomew Ferrero, they were Portuguese, or at least we know that Cabrillo was. Ferrero, we're not quite sure. We believe he's Portuguese, but he might have been Spanish. But anyways, both of them were sailing for Spain anyways. So they sailed north from the west coast of Mexico, down around the bottom horn that we're used to, like the Baja region, and they start to make their way up, and they're trying to find out, is California, or the little strip of land that they're on, is it an island, or is there more to it? So they initially make their way up to San Diego. Once they make it to San Diego, Cabrillo, he dies when he falls and breaks his arm and eventually develops gangrene and dies on this little island. But this was not supposed to stop Ferrero, so he decides, all right, we're here. Let's just continue on this expedition. Now, another driving force behind the fact that he didn't just want to turn around and go back was the fact that Hernan Cortez had shown up into Mexico and was starting to make a try to push north into the Southwest and started to make his claim there and stake his claim and gain more territory. So there was other explorers who were trying to make a name for themselves and trying to establish regions for them that they could maybe obtain a governorship or a viceroyship over the region. So he pushes forwards. So he pushes forward up with his ships, which are very poorly supplied at this point. And the other issue that comes is during this time, the weather is just horrendous the whole time that they are out there. And the men, they lack supplies. They keep coming along these coastlines that are just tall, rocky, hard to get to. And when they finally do find some areas that are good ports, they map those out. They try to dock, and they find that the natives themselves, they were not friendly. And frequently these natives would chase them away from the shorelines and back onto their boats. And so none of them were ever actually able to get off and establish any ports or any port cities during this time. Now, like I said, he was able to chart a number of usable harbors, and more importantly, he found that California was not an island. He was able to make his way almost all the way up to the lower portion of Oregon, so that's why we understand how far up the coastline goes. And so this establishes a route that you can go up and down in California, and eventually starts to drive more explorers to start looking into the California region. Again, we're going to start to see the Spanish influence start to develop up along the coastlines and into the Southwest. This is the impact that these Spanish explorers have upon early Western settlement. So we are going to further look into the settlements that were established and some of the towns that came about from this time frame. And then we're also going to discuss a little bit here in the history of how the impact that the Jesuits had on these native populations. And again, we're going to do a deeper dive exploration of the interactions between the administrative state and the Spanish and the Catholic Church. So thank you for joining me for this presentation on Spanish explorers, and I'll see you in the next presentation here.